August 2019, Wellsfield, Massachusetts. What seemed like a peaceful, affluent life for Edith Stroud ended in a pool of her own blood, her twisted plot to eliminate her family finally catching up to her. Edith Edie Stroud, 67, was known in Wellsfield as a woman of elegance and power. She was the widow of Gregory Stroud, a well-respected businessman who had amassed a significant fortune over the years. But beneath Edie's charming and grandmotherly exterior was a woman who thrived on control, especially over her late husband's estate. She had no children of her own, and this fact ate away at her, even though her stepchildren, Helen and Thomas Stroud, never saw her as a mother figure. When Gregory, 70, died unexpectedly in 2017 from what was ruled a heart attack, Edie's demeanor at the funeral was unsettling. While others wept, Edie remained composed, her eyes cold and calculating as she quietly discussed the division of his estate with a few close friends. From that moment, it was clear that Edie's concern was not for her deceased husband, but for the wealth and power he had left behind. Helen Stroud, 45, Gregory's daughter from his first marriage, was a successful real estate agent. She had always struggled with emotional insecurities, particularly after her first marriage fell apart. Her relationship with Edie had never been close, but it was civil, at least on the surface. But Helen never imagined that Edie would become her greatest threat. Thomas Stroud, 50, Gregory's only son, was a quiet, reclusive man. He had distanced himself from his father's world of business after a series of personal failures. A man troubled by his past, Thomas lived a quiet life, but the recent death of his father and the mounting tensions over the inheritance pulled him back into Edie's orbit. Little did he know that this return to the family would mark the beginning of a deadly game, with him as one of Edie's targets. Reeling from Gregory's death, both Helen and Thomas naturally assumed they would inherit their father's estate. But what they didn't know was that Edie had already begun planting the seeds of her sinister plot. Edie felt that Gregory's fortune rightfully belonged to her. Helen and Thomas, in her mind, didn't deserve a penny. After all, she had been Gregory's wife for 25 years, staying by his side through sickness and success. The resentment festered, and soon Edie's thoughts turned to how she could remove both Helen and Thomas permanently from her life. Enter Victor Gallagher, 28, a handyman who had been doing odd jobs around Edie's mansion. Victor was tall, rough around the edges, with a scruffy beard and troubled past. He'd been in and out of low-paying jobs, barely making ends meet, but when he crossed paths with Edie, his life changed, though not for the better. Victor saw Edie as his ticket to a better life. He was drawn to her wealth and the air of sophistication she carried. Edie, in turn, saw him as the perfect pawn. Despite the age difference, she seduced him, weaving a web of manipulation through promises of money, a stable life, and a luxury he had never known. Victor, desperate for a change, fell right into her trap. It started with small tasks. Edie had Victor run errands, attend to repairs around the house, and eventually stay over at her estate. But soon these innocent tasks shifted into something darker. Edie whispered lies into Victor's ears, telling him that Helen and Thomas were plotting to take everything from her. She played on his insecurities, convincing him that they would eventually turn on him too. As the relationship between Edie and Victor grew more twisted, Edie tightened her grip. She would shower him with expensive gifts, Rolex watches, designer clothes, but would withhold them just as quickly if Victor didn't meet her demands. Victor, blinded by his desire for a better life, became increasingly dependent on Edie, willing to do whatever she asked. At this point, Helen had begun to sense that something wasn't quite right with Edie. Every time she visited, Edie's kindness felt forced, her conversations laced with veiled comments about Helen's abilities to manage her own life. Helen didn't know it then, but Edie's control was tightening, and she would soon be caught in a deadly scheme. With Victor firmly under her control, Edie decided it was time to take her plan further. Her first target, Helen. To Edie, Helen was weak, emotionally vulnerable, and easy to manipulate. Edie wanted Helen gone, but she knew she had to make it look like a natural death, something no one would question. Edie, with her vast knowledge of plants from years of gardening, found the perfect weapon, a rare herb known for its ability to cause slow poisoning. The symptoms would mimic a natural illness: fatigue, nausea, confusion, until the victim finally succumbed. Edie began lacing Helen's food with small doses of this herb, watching as Helen's health gradually deteriorated. At first, Helen thought she was simply overworked, blaming her symptoms on stress. But as the weeks went on, her condition worsened. She felt weaker every day, barely able to keep up with her work as a real estate agent. Edie, playing the role of the concerned stepmother, offered to take care of Helen during this time, preparing her meals and visiting her often. But behind this facade, Edie took sick pleasure in watching Helen's slow decline, knowing she held her stepdaughter's life in her hands. Victor, now fully entangled in Edie's web, helped keep Helen isolated, ensuring no one else could intervene. He believed Edie's lies, that Helen was plotting against them both, and became complicit in her gradual poisoning. Edie's control over Victor had become absolute, and with Helen growing weaker by the day, she knew she was close to eliminating her first target. Finally, one evening, Helen collapsed in her home. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Her death was ruled as heart failure, a tragic but not unexpected outcome given her recent illness. At Helen's funeral, Edie put on a grand display of grief, but inside she felt nothing but satisfaction. She had succeeded in removing Helen from the picture. But Thomas, seeing his sister's sudden death, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He began to suspect that Edie's calmness in the wake of these tragedies wasn't normal. What Thomas didn't realize was that he was next on Edie's list. With Helen out of the way, Edie's focus shifted to Thomas. He had always been the quieter of the two siblings, keeping to himself and avoiding conflict. But Edie knew that with him alive, she couldn't claim full control of Gregory's estate. She needed to eliminate him too, and this time, she would be even more ruthless. Edie began by pretending to offer Thomas comfort, playing on his grief over the loss of his father and sister. She would invite him to her mansion, pouring him glass after glass of whiskey, encouraging him to drink more and more. Slowly, Edie began feeding him lies, just as she had done with Helen. She convinced Thomas that the stress of the inheritance battle had killed his sister, and that he was headed down the same path. Victor, meanwhile, was growing increasingly unstable. The weight of what he had done, helping Edie poison Helen, was beginning to take its toll. He started drinking heavily, becoming erratic, and for the first time, he began questioning Edie's motives. But Edie wasn't about to let him slip away so easily. She tightened her grip on him, using their twisted sexual relationship to keep him close. As Thomas sank deeper into depression, Edie continued to isolate him from his friends and any potential support. She made sure he stayed drunk and emotionally broken, feeding him a steady stream of alcohol and drugs. Edie had perfected her manipulation tactics, and she knew it was only a matter of time before Thomas would crumble completely. Then one night, Edie saw her opportunity. After a particularly heavy drinking session, she left a loaded gun within Thomas's reach. She subtly planted the idea in his head, telling him that maybe it was time to rest, that maybe he had suffered enough. In his drunken, emotional state, Thomas took the gun. Edie staged the scene perfectly, making his death look like a suicide, complete with a forged note. With Thomas dead, Edie believed she had finally secured Gregory's entire fortune for herself. But the cracks in her plan were beginning to show. Victor was spiraling, haunted by what they had done, and Edie's control over him was starting to slip. As the investigation into Helen and Thomas's deaths began to close in, Edie's world started to unravel. Detectives were beginning to piece together the strange circumstances surrounding the deaths, and rumors in town were starting to spread. Edie's once perfect image as a wealthy widow was beginning to crack, and she knew it. Victor, consumed by guilt and fear, started drinking even more heavily. He began to leave small clues, either intentionally or out of sheer desperation, that pointed investigators toward Edie. The pressure was mounting, and Edie's control over him weakened with each passing day. One night, in a moment of sheer panic, Edie decided to take drastic action. She couldn't risk Victor betraying her, so she made the decision to kill him before he could turn her in. But when she tried to make her move, Victor fought back. The struggle was chaotic and violent, their relationship, once twisted by desire and control, now devolving into raw, brutal violence. In the end, it was Edie's own knife that ended her life. In the midst of the struggle, she accidentally stabbed herself, collapsing in a pool of her own blood. As she lay dying, Edie's last thoughts were of triumph, believing she had won, even as everything around her fell apart. Victor, bloodied and broken, stood over her body, finally free from her grasp, but forever haunted by the role he played in the deaths of Helen and Thomas. The investigation would soon uncover the horrific truth of Edie's murderous plot. But for those who knew her, the real horror was how far she had been willing to go. Driven by greed, jealousy, and an insatiable desire for control. After Edith's gruesome death, the aftermath was just as chaotic as her life. For years, Edie Stroud had controlled everything, her family, her wealth, and even the people around her. But as she lay in a pool of blood on her luxurious marble floor, it was clear that her reign of terror was over. Her once grand mansion, filled with expensive artwork and polished furniture, had now become a crime scene, a twisted reflection of the sinister life Edie had lived. As Victor Gallagher stood over her body, shaken and covered in blood, the weight of everything they had done finally crashed down on him. The murders of Helen and Thomas, the lies, the manipulation. It all hit him like a tidal wave. He stumbled back, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. The twisted relationship that had bound him to Edith had finally reached its deadly conclusion, and there was no going back. Victor, now in a complete daze, fumbled for his phone. His hands shook as he dialed the only number he could think of, 911. When the operator answered, he struggled to form coherent sentences. His words were jumbled, his voice strained as he tried to explain the chaos that had just unfolded. In a matter of minutes, the once still night in Wellsfield erupted into a frenzy as police cars and ambulances rushed toward the Stroud mansion. But the story was far from over. When the police arrived, they were met with a scene of absolute destruction. Edith's mansion, which had always been a symbol of her wealth and status, now looked like the aftermath of a war. Broken glass littered the floors, and expensive art pieces were shattered beyond recognition. The once pristine rooms were now stained with blood. Edith's blood. It was clear from the moment investigators entered that this wasn't a simple accident or even an isolated crime. There was something much darker at play here. Detective Marissa Collins, 42, was one of the first to arrive on the scene. She had been with the Wellsfield Police Department for over 20 years, and she had seen her fair share of crime. But as she stepped into the chaos of Edith Stroud's mansion, she knew this case was different. There was something about the eerie stillness, the shattered wealth, and the dead body of one of Wellsfield's most influential women that set off alarm bells in her mind. Victor was immediately taken into custody. His clothes were drenched in blood, and his eyes were wild with fear and confusion. At first glance, it seemed obvious that he was the one responsible for Edie's death. But as investigators began to dig deeper into the history of the Stroud family, they realized this was far more complicated than a simple murder. Edith Stroud's death wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. As the investigation progressed, Detective Collins and her team began to uncover the dark and twisted secrets of the Stroud family. The deaths of Helen and Thomas, once thought to be tragic but unrelated, were suddenly thrown into a new light. Investigators found themselves retracing the steps of the past few years, slowly piecing together the horrifying puzzle that Edie had orchestrated. They started with Helen's death. The autopsy had shown that Helen had died of heart failure, which seemed plausible at the time given her reported health issues. But when the detectives re-examined the case, certain details didn't add up. For one, Helen had been perfectly healthy before her sudden illness. And then there was Edie's behavior at the funeral. So calm, so unaffected. Detective Collins couldn't shake the feeling that Edie had been involved somehow. It wasn't long before the toxicology reports came back, revealing that Helen had been poisoned. The substance was traced to a rare herb that only a handful of people in the area would even know about, Edith Stroud being one of them. Suddenly, Helen's death was no longer just a tragic heart failure. It was murder, and Edie had been the mastermind. But what about Thomas? His death had been ruled a suicide, and even the stage scene pointed to that conclusion. He had been found in his home, slumped over, with a gun in his hand and a note nearby. But the detectives began to question the authenticity of that note. Thomas had never been the type to leave things unsaid, and the tone of the note didn't match his personality. Further analysis revealed inconsistencies in the handwriting. Edie had forged the note herself. With these two revelations, the full extent of Edie's sinister plot came to light. She had orchestrated the deaths of her stepchildren, manipulating every detail to make their deaths look natural or self-inflicted. Edith Stroud had been playing a deadly game all along, using her wealth, charm, and manipulation to get what she wanted. But there was one final piece of the puzzle. Victor Gallagher. Investigators knew he had been involved in Edie's life, but as they interrogated him further, they realized just how deep his involvement went. Victor had been Edith's pawn from the beginning. She had manipulated him, seduced him, and turned him into her accomplice in the murders of Helen and Thomas. Through a series of interviews and psychological evaluations, Victor's descent into madness became clear. He had been vulnerable when he met Edie, drifting from job to job with no real direction in life. Edie had seen that vulnerability and exploited it, offering him not only financial stability, but also a twisted version of love. At first, Victor didn't question Edie's motives. She convinced him that Helen and Thomas were enemies, people who would ruin everything if given the chance. Slowly but surely, Victor found himself doing things he never thought he was capable of. Spying on Helen, poisoning her food, and finally helping stage Thomas's suicide. The deeper Victor got, the more he lost himself, until he became nothing more than a puppet dancing on Edie's strings. But there was one thing Edie hadn't counted on: Victor's guilt. After Helen and Thomas were dead, the weight of what he had done began to crush him. He started drinking heavily, trying to drown out the memories of his actions. But no matter how much he drank, he couldn't escape the reality of what he had become. By the time Edie turned her sights on him, Victor was already unraveling. He knew too much, had seen too much, and the pressure was unbearable. That's when the final confrontation happened, the moment when everything came crashing down. In those final moments of chaos, as Edie and Victor fought for control, it became clear that there would be no winners. Their relationship, once built on manipulation and deceit, had devolved into something violent and destructive. Edie, in her desperation, tried to kill Victor, but her plans backfired. In the struggle, she ended up stabbing herself, sealing her own fate. As Edie lay dying, Victor stood over her, numb and broken. The woman who had controlled his every move was finally gone, but the damage had already been done. There was no going back for Victor. He had been a willing participant in Edie's murderous games, and now he would have to face the consequences. When news of Edith Stroud's death and the shocking revelations of her crimes spread through Wellsfield, the small town was rocked to its core. No one could believe that the sweet, grandmotherly widow had been behind such a twisted and deadly plot. The Stroud mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood as a grim reminder of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. The investigation continued for months, with detectives uncovering more and more evidence of Edie's manipulations. It became clear that Edie had been planning her murderous plot for years, carefully crafting every detail to ensure that she would get away with it. But in the end, her own greed and paranoia had been her undoing. Victor Gallagher was eventually sentenced to life in prison for his role in the deaths of Helen and Thomas. Though he claimed he had been manipulated by Edie, the court found him guilty of being a willing participant in her deadly games. Victor's descent into madness was complete. Once a man with potential, he had become nothing more than a broken pawn in Edie's twisted scheme. As for Edie, her death marked the end of a dark chapter in the Stroud family's history. But even in death, her legacy lived on, a legacy of greed, jealousy, and cold-blooded murder.